At exactly 3:17 p.m. EST, the long-standing bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada underwent a terminal, irreversible severance. This high-stakes secure video conference, which had taken days of back-channel diplomacy to arrange, was intended to be the final chance for the two nations to find an off-ramp from a month of escalating economic and sovereign conflict. Both governments brought their full weight to the digital table. On the American side sat President Trump, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and senior staff, while Canada was represented by Prime Minister Mark Carney, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, the Foreign Minister, and the Defense Minister. The participants were not there for trivialities. They were there to determine if the bedrock of North American stability could be salvaged. President Trump initiated the conversation with a dismissive tone, characterizing the intense period of economic warfare and sovereignty disputes as nonsense that needed to end, so the countries could return to normal. He proposed a deal that appeared on its surface to be a diplomatic victory for Canada. Under his offer, the United States would immediately remove all tariffs on Canadian goods, reaffirm its commitment to NORAD and joint continental defense, restore full intelligence sharing, and formally acknowledge Canadian sovereignty. To any casual observer, this looked like the US was finally yielding to Canadian demands. However, the proposal was strictly conditional, and the price tag attached revealed an asymmetrical demand for total Canadian capitulation. In exchange for these concessions, Trump demanded three things that would have effectively stripped Canada of its defensive and economic autonomy. First, he required Canada to immediately reverse the financial restrictions it had placed on US banks and pledged to never use such economic weapons again, effectively disarming the country's most potent leverage. Second, he demanded a 10-year energy export agreement, legally binding Canada to supply American energy needs at market prices regardless of how the US treated Canada during that decade. Third, he insisted that Canada withdraw from the Alternative Security Partnership Fund recently approved by NATO and return exclusively to traditional structures where the US retains primary control. Prime Minister Carney listened to the entirety of this proposal without a single interruption, meticulously analyzing the true intent behind the diplomatic language. When the president concluded, Carney asked one surgical question. He wanted to know if these terms were starting points for a genuine negotiation, or if they were presented as non-negotiable conditions. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly when Trump responded with a take-it-or-leave-it ultimatum, accompanied by a direct threat that the situation would deteriorate significantly for Canada if the offer was rejected. Carney did not react with anger or performative outrage. Instead, he spoke for 3 minutes, calmly dismantling the premise of the offer. He pointed out the irony of the US demanding trust after repeatedly violating past agreements and questioning Canada's own territorial integrity. He explained that these demands were not a path to partnership, but a blueprint for Canadian surrender, a sacrifice of sovereignty in exchange for promises that had already proven unreliable. Carney delivered the final verdict with absolute clarity. The proposal was unreasonable, the ultimatum was unacceptable, and Canada would not surrender. With 8 final historic words, Canada will not surrender. This call is over. Carney disconnected, leaving the American delegation to face a blank black screen and the reality of a relationship that had died in that silence. The atmosphere inside the White House Situation Room immediately following the disconnection was defined by a profound, suffocating silence. When the secure video conference link was severed, the most powerful officials in the American government, including the President, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor, did not immediately speak or move. They sat frozen, staring at the blank black screen, collectively processing the reality that a sovereign leader had not just walked away from a negotiation, but had unilaterally terminated the diplomatic relationship between the two nations. This was an outcome that defied the established norms of international relations and shattered the president's long-held conviction that no leader would dare walk away from him. The silence was eventually broken by President Trump, whose reaction was one of pure, raw disbelief, rather than strategic analysis. His first comment, "He hung up on me," captured the shock of a man who had spent his entire career operating under the assumption that he held all the cards and that the other side would always eventually concede to his demands. In a moment that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the power dynamics at play, the president turned to his advisors and immediately inquired whether they could reconnect the call. He seemed to view the incident not as a formal diplomatic severance but as a technical malfunction or a momentary lapse in discipline that could be fixed with a simple redial. The National Security Advisor was forced to perform the uncomfortable task of explaining the gravity of the situation. Prime Minister Carney had intentionally ended the call, and attempting to force a reconnection without clear Canadian consent would be not only diplomatically inappropriate, but potentially counterproductive. As the reality of the rejection set in, the president's disbelief quickly pivoted to anger. He demanded that his staff call Carney back with an even more aggressive ultimatum, threatening to completely sever all trade, energy, and cooperation if the Prime Minister did not immediately return to the table. This outburst brought the room to a cold, sobering realization for his senior officials. The Secretary of State then had to deliver a difficult, necessary reality check to the president. The United States lacked the legal and economic mechanism to unilaterally cut off all trade with Canada. They explained that such a drastic action would require congressional approval, and even if it were possible, it would likely devastate the American economy far more severely than the Canadian one. The United States is deeply dependent on Canadian energy, raw materials, and the complex cross-border supply chains that sustain millions of American jobs. When the president finally asked, "Then what can I do?" the response from his assembled advisors was effectively nothing. Every piece of leverage the administration possessed, every tariff, every threat, every pressure tactic had already been deployed, and Canada had absorbed the impact, prepared for the worst, and successfully created alternatives to everything the US provided. The president was left sitting in the most secure room in the world, surrounded by the full apparatus of American power, only to realize he had been completely checkmated. At 4:47 p.m., 90 minutes after the video conference had abruptly ended, Prime Minister Mark Carney walked to a podium in the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. He spoke for less than 6 minutes, refused to take any questions, and delivered a speech that effectively dismantled the remaining possibility of a repaired US-Canada relationship. This was not a standard political press conference. It was a formal, calculated declaration of Canadian independence from American influence. Carney stated clearly that he had participated in the call to explore the potential for a peaceful resolution, but had ultimately concluded that negotiation with the current US administration was impossible. He explained that the United States was not seeking a compromise or a balanced path forward, it was seeking the total capitulation of Canada. He stated with absolute finality that Canada would not capitulate. The announcements that followed this statement were, by design, devastating to the status quo. Carney declared that all formal negotiations with the United States were suspended indefinitely. This was not a temporary pause or a tactical delay. It was a total shutdown of the diplomatic machinery that had connected the two nations for decades. There were no future calls scheduled, no back-channel discussions left open, and no special envoys appointed to bridge the gap. By closing these doors, Canada signaled that the era of relying on American partnership had effectively come to a close. Canada would now shift its focus entirely toward building independent security capabilities through the Alternative Security Partnership Fund. The $8.2 billion security framework, which the United States had previously demanded Canada abandon, was now confirmed as the primary pillar of Canada's future defense strategy. In terms of economic policy, Carney announced a permanent shift in energy strategy. Canada will aggressively move to diversify its energy export markets, intentionally reducing its reliance on American buyers. The pipelines and infrastructure that once flowed exclusively south to feed the American energy market are now being slated for redirection toward Asian and European economies. This energy relationship, which had defined North American stability and economics since 1945, is currently being dismantled piece by piece. Carney also confirmed that the financial restrictions placed on US banks, which the US had demanded be removed, would not only remain in place but would be expanded. Canada is constructing a permanent economic firewall to protect its domestic stability from the volatility of American policy, making any future reconnection significantly more difficult to achieve. Carney concluded his 6-minute address by framing Canada's path forward, not as an act of hostility, but as a commitment to sovereignty. He clarified that while Canada does not seek a state of confrontation with its neighbour, it is no longer willing to accept the role of a subordinate. He emphasized that any future partnership must be built on the bedrock of mutual respect and the recognition of Canada as an equal. Until the United States is prepared to engage on those specific terms, Canada will proceed on its own course. He signaled that Canada will no longer wait for permission from Washington to defend its interests or to secure its economic future. By the time he left the stage, Carney had achieved what few leaders ever do. He had forced the most powerful country on earth to accept that its influence has limits, and that Canada's alignment, from this day forward, is entirely on its own terms. The global markets and international community reacted to Canada's declaration of independence with immediate, measurable precision. Within minutes of Prime Minister Carney concluding his press conference, currency traders, some of the most rational and cold-blooded participants in the global economy, delivered their verdict on the situation. The Canadian dollar strengthened by 1.7% against the US dollar, a rare and significant move for a currency when its largest trading partner just announced an indefinite severance of relations. This appreciation signaled that the global market perceived Canada's shift toward independent sovereignty as a stabilizing rather than destabilizing force. Investors concluded that Canada's move to diversify its partnerships was a rational strategy that reduced the long-term risk of being tied to American political volatility. Conversely, the American market reaction was immediate and punitive. U.S. energy stocks dropped sharply as traders priced in the near certainty that Canadian oil and natural gas supplies would be permanently redirected toward non-U.S. markets. For energy companies heavily dependent on Canadian imports, this signaled a massive, unavoidable disruption to their business models. Similarly, utility stocks throughout the American Midwest plummeted. These utilities have relied for decades on cheap, consistent electricity generated by Canadian hydroelectric power. With that supply now officially uncertain and no backup infrastructure in place to replace it, investors recognize that these utility companies face a future of drastically higher costs and unpredictable shortages. This realization caused broad selling across the S&P 500, which fell 2.3%, as investors recognized that the foundational trade relationship of the North American continent was effectively broken. The geopolitical consequences were equally profound and unfolded with unprecedented speed. Within 2 hours of the announcement, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a rare joint statement. These three pillars of the European economy and NATO publicly validated Canada's decision to suspend negotiations, explicitly citing the lack of good faith engagement from the United States. By taking this stance, these powers did not simply offer diplomatic pleasantries, they fundamentally shifted their alignment. They signaled to the rest of the world that they no longer view the US as a reliable, honest broker in international negotiations. Instead, they recognized Canada as the stable, dependable partner. This is not just a diplomatic critique. It is a structural realignment that tells every other nation on Earth that standing against American pressure is no longer a path to isolation, but a path to a broader coalition of supportive allies. This alignment has created a new, undeniable reality for global power dynamics. Canada's decision to activate and lead the Alternative Security Partnership Fund has effectively transformed NATO from an American-led security apparatus into a truly multilateral framework where U.S. participation is welcome, but no longer required. European nations have watched this crisis and concluded that they must have a security architecture that functions even when the United States is acting as a source of instability rather than a guarantor of security. By siding with Canada, these nations have set a precedent that cannot be unset. They have proven that independent security capabilities are possible and that European and Commonwealth powers are willing to fill the vacuum left by a withdrawing United States. The international order has been irrevocably altered, and the global market is already pricing in a future where American influence is no longer the automatic baseline for global trade or continental security. The rupture in the US-Canada relationship is not a temporary diplomatic dispute. It is a fundamental, structural change that marks the end of the era of North American integration that has existed since 1945. The decisions made in the wake of the severance are permanent, as both nations are currently implementing infrastructure projects and security policies that cannot be easily unwound. Canada is actively and aggressively negotiating long-term energy agreements with markets in Asia and Europe, effectively reconfiguring its entire national output to bypass the United States. Once pipelines, liquefied natural gas (LNG) terminals, and supply chains are redirected to feed international markets, this infrastructure will become the new backbone of the Canadian economy. The flow of Canadian resources, which once secured American energy needs and provided stability, will be physically and contractually locked into trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade routes. leaving the United States with a permanent structural deficit in reliable energy imports. The strategic burden placed upon the United States as a result of this severance is immediate and carries a staggering financial cost. For decades, the US-Canada relationship allowed for an undefended border and seamless intelligence sharing, which were major assets to American national security. Now, the United States must independently develop and fund all the surveillance, monitoring, and defensive capabilities previously provided by or shared with Canada. This includes the massive expense of building out northern border security to a standard that prevents the exploitation of what was once the world's longest undefended boundary. Estimates for these new surveillance, intelligence, and border security requirements are reaching into the tens of billions of dollars annually, a fiscal impact that will place significant long-term strain on the federal budget. Beyond the financial cost, the US faces a profound loss of regional influence. By forcing Canada to seek alternative security arrangements through the Alternative Security Partnership Fund, the United States has inadvertently accelerated the transformation of NATO. The alliance is evolving from a system where American leadership was the unquestioned baseline into a multilateral framework where individual members or groups of members can function independently of Washington. The international community is witnessing a new precedent, a model of cooperation that explicitly excludes American approval as a necessity. This shift in power dynamics means that the United States is no longer the sole guarantor of stability in the West, as allies have already signaled that they are prepared to align with partners who offer consistency over coercion. The era where the US could assume the automatic compliance of its northern neighbor is finished, and the United States now faces the stark reality of being excluded from the very structures and trade partnerships it once defined.